Hey gang, I hope your world is good. Mine is fantastic. These twin desks were made from upcycled material. Let's jump right in. Hopefully you saw my recent video of a spectacular dining room table and chairs, and my photographer, Paul McPherson, he had this boxes, and he wanted a couple of desktops, and I thought, sure, we can do that. They were a little bit short. These are only about 4 foot. However, he wanted the desks at 64 inches. So yeah, we could do that. We'll have to use the board stretcher. So there were these pine legs coming out of the bottom of these. I don't even really know what these were exactly. They were some kind of wedding prop. Anyway, they have these pins and you can't hardly get those out by trying to pull them. They just, even with dull cutters, they just break. So rather than snipping those, I like to just grab them here, wiggle them back and forth. They break off flush, right? They just break off flush if you do that. If you try to snip them, they're going to be sticking out. But this way, at least they break off below the surface. Yeah. And then I'll just mark where they were so at least I know where they're at. I won't run this through the planer, I know, at least not on this side. I then ripped all those panels into widths that I could use, 22 pieces, both long and short. Biscuits are cheaper than dominoes, and I thought this would be a great application for the biscuit joiner, and this is my favorite way to use it. I have it anchored to a board with sandpaper. I also have a cleat in place so I can cut those dead center without having to measure. Quick note here, I'm referencing off the top surface. And I certainly love any excuse I have to use this TecoVolt shooting board in my shooting plane. I made a video recently sharing some of this board's incredible features. I'll leave a link in the description. Of course, shooting the ends ensures that the butt joints end up clean and crisp. Over the course of the day, I was able to get all 22 of these glued up. Actually, I made one extra. This material was kind of thin to begin with, 19 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch. So I decided to add some biscuits for alignment. That way I wouldn't lose too much on the final thickness. It seemed a little odd or counterproductive to take panels that were perfectly good, cut them into strips, and then re-glue them. But it was the only way I could think of to add the length. All right, here's one for you. I've got these boards that I'm gluing up, and this is the next day, so 24 hours later. I forgot to get this glue off. You can see all these beads. I think you can. Anyway, it's rock hard, and you probably are aware that if you just try to scrape that, sometimes it can pull some of the wood right out of that joint. So here's an easy solution. We can plasticize it, soften that glue by friction with an old belt on a belt sander, and now I can scrape that without having to worry about tear out from the glue pulling the wood fibers out, yeah? Here I'm creating a quick reference to center of this breadboard end, and I'll just line up one of my dog holes with the center. And I've noticed that I have a little bit of a hump right here by using a straight edge, and I can just clean that up quickly and make that straight. I can use a strong light to check that. And now I want to make a spring joint by creating a little bit of a belly in the middle of that breadboard. It's easy and quick to do, and I'll show you soon just how effective it can be. Here I created a story pole, and I can use that to make a jig. With this jig, I can use a router to cut tenons on each end of the table. The center mortise and tenon will be tight. There's a total of 5 mortise and tenons, but the outside ones will have slack so that the table can expand, contract seasonally. This chunk of melamine had been a sacrificial piece. I'm surprised I even had it, but it'll work perfect for this jig. I'm just going to throw it away after I get done. But here I can mark center on these pieces. These correspond to the marks that I made on the other piece. And now I have this ugly thing that's going to be very effective to cut the tenons. And with that same story pole, I can transfer marks to the breadboard. We can cut those mortises. The Panther router utilizes center marks, so again with this story pole I can line things up with the center of the table. And I'm utilizing these stop blocks that I make and sell. Yeah, these are a fabulous addition to the Panther router. I use mine all the time. Of course, they're a great reference when routing a piece of wood, or like I'm doing here, I can bring this fence back to exactly the prior location. Check out Panther Router's new air clamps. They're awesome. Now, I added this little block to connect an air hose, and then bring your workpiece in place, hit the switch, bam. And they rotate 360 degrees, so no more need for bridges. And notice the fence is notched, so it'll accommodate one of these. If you're not familiar with the Panther router, this is how simple it is to set the depth. You bring the router bit till it just touches the workpiece. I call that the 0-point reference. Then here you have this depth gauge and stop. There's a scale, metric or imperial. You tighten the lever, boom, done. Here I wanted to make a test cut just to show you. I'll add the shroud, but that is exactly how deep the bit will plunge. This video is not exactly a tutorial on the Panther router, but those that aren't familiar, there's a stylus that is guided by a template, and that dictates the length or the size of the mortise. It is such a fantastic machine, and quickly I can cut all of these mortises, and they're super accurate. Oh, and notice that I only had to mark one breadboard. I made a cool little jig that references off the first mortise you made. I'll make a short production run of these jigs just to see how they sell, but it's a fantastic way to produce repeated mortises. Here I'm marking where the actual cuts will be made. This will make more sense here in a bit. The router I'm using is quite large at 3¼ horsepower, but I thought I'd remove most of the material just to make it easier. To me, it makes sense to just do this outside, right? A lot less of a mess. And for those that are thinking that this is dangerous, then simply don't do it. I installed cabinets and countertops for decades, and I'm very comfortable using a skill saw this way. I can easily see the line and the blade. I have a firm grip, the material is thin, and there's zero chance of kickback. And here, of course, you can see the reason for the holes. I can finish things up with a jigsaw. Awesome, easy, and effective. I've got a collar on my router. I can use a template to create these tenons super clean. I prefer a plunge router for something like this because I can make those cuts in incremental steps. I don't need to take all that material at once. And here I clamped a sacrificial piece just to prevent tear out where the bit will exit. Oh hey, check this out. So this is my 1 meter straight edge, which I love. I put some 180 grit sandpaper on one side. See, without it, sliption. Yeah. With, boom, gription. And somehow I didn't get footage of me routing this rebate out, rabbit, whatever you want to call it. But I just used a large diameter, like a slab cutting bit, to clean that all up. And I can use a shoulder plane to make that shoulder nice and crispy. And of course, where the router and shoulder plane exit, I use a sacrificial block that I can just screw on or clamp or whatever to back up those cuts. And here I'm just using a jigsaw to clean up those inside radiuses. Super easy, fast, easy, effective. Did I mention easy? So here I have both breadboards clamped into place, and I have this block of wood with a mark dead in the center, and I can use this to line up with those marks I made originally with the story pole, using a simple clamping pad to avoid smashing the wood on the top surface. Clamp this block in place, and now I have a perfect reference for a domino, and I'm going to show you how we can do this without using dowels. Dominoes are just quick and easy. And I can simply just use the tight and the large setting on this XL700. It's a very effective way to create a mortise and tenon joint with a breadboard with the ability for the main part of the top to expand and contract. I love this 90-degree deck that I sell, and I can attach it to either machine, and now it gives me a wide platform or footprint. Very stable when making plunge cuts. Now, you may have noticed that the tenons on this tabletop are a little bit unique. There is no shoulder on the bottom. This is the bottom. You can see that bottom portion just slips right in, creating part of the tenon. Because the tabletop was so thin, I didn't have room to create a rebate or rabbet on the top and bottom. So I just did it on the top. Should work. So yeah, many ways to do things, right? That's one aspect of woodworking that I certainly love, is just figuring things out, not necessarily following, conventional protocol, and just making it work. So of course these outer tenons will get the wide setting on the XL700, and that will give us enough room for expansion and contraction. And I don't need one in the middle. I know you can do one as a drawbore, but I'm just going to glue it and clamp it. And here you can see with the dominoes centered, because of the narrow slot in the breadboard, this will give us a bit of slack. All right, I've added plenty of glue to just the middle mortise and tenon. You can kind of see it squeezed out there, and I've clamped the breadboard in place. And now I can glue in these dominoes that were cut in on the narrow setting, and I just want to add glue to the breadboard. I don't want to glue that domino all the way into part of the table or the tenon, right? Those outer dominoes need to allow movement. Rather than using a big hammer, I just use a block of wood and a clamp to drive that dude home. So in the countertop arena, this strip of wood is known as buildup, and of course its function is to create the thickness that we're after. It's a nice tight fit, and I can just clamp those in place. There are a lot of ways to do this. I have a ton of these clamps from my former years as a solid surface fabricator, and it's just an easy and quick way to do it. I have 4 buckets of those clamps, and they're super handy, but I thought I'd show another option on the other side, which is just a strip of wood that acts as a cowl, and some regular clamps. All right, let's get these dudes nice and flush, and of course my favorite is with a belt sander. And here I have a belt that's slightly used. It has some glue on it, or embedded in it, I should say. And this will be perfect. I can just get it close and then finish up with a nice clean belt. You can see I was kind of struggling here with this top, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to take this over to my workbench. It'll be a lot more stable there. I suppose I could use a clamp to the sawhorse or something, but of course everything will turn out better if your work isn't moving, especially while you're using a belt sander. And technically you should start with the bottom anyway. There's less risk of damaging the top, although I do have a blanket underneath this desktop. You're probably thinking, why not just use thicker material to begin with? Yeah, it would have been way easier and faster. I was trying to do my customer a favor, thinking that we could utilize this material, and I hated to see that material go in the trash. And I like to think of it like this. Challenges are where we gain our experience, yeah? Here's a quick tip for you. So when you're spreading glue, a lot of times I like to just put my glue on here, right? I don't have a brush, but what I can do is this goes in this orientation, but I'm going to set it this way. Just set it down, pull it back up, turn it around 180 degrees. And now I know I've effectively spread that glue. Let's see what that looks. That is awesome, right? Very effective. Works really well if you're spreading PL400 or silicone on the back of a panel, for instance. Yeah. So a question I get asked a lot are my sanding steps. So first is 120 with a belt sander, and that removes mill marks from a joiner or planer. And then 180 with a belt sander removes the 120 scratches, and then 180 with a DA like this to remove any belt sander scratches. And that's it, I'm done. I'm always using a top coat type finish. If I use an oil for a small box, for instance, I will go to a higher grit, maybe 400. Whenever I'm doing a project that will inevitably get spilled with, water or beer or whatever, I like using conversion varnish. It'll hold up way better than lacquer, and it's just a fantastic finish. I don't always use it. It costs a little bit more, and the prep is a little bit more time consuming, but when it counts, this stuff is the bomb. And this may look like amateur hour here. I've got my pressure really high. I'm spraying outside, not getting good coverage. Well, that is all intentional. Spraying outside this time of year is perfect. It's not too hot. There's not any bugs in the air. The coverage, I want a mist coat. I don't want to put it on too heavy. This will provide good tack or adhesion for the second coat, and that air pressure, this ensures that I get really fine particles or fine atomization. That extra turbulence or overspray that I'm actually creating, at this point it doesn't matter whatsoever. Since they're seal coats, it'll all get sanded back. I'll do 2 light seal coats, sand lightly with 220 grit and some maroon Scotch-Brite, and then 1 final coat. With conversion varnish, I thin the seal coats about 15%, the top coat 10%. If I'm shooting lacquer, I thin all of it about 25%. Whilst I was at it and spraying conversion varnish, I figured I would refinish our 2 end tables. My customer brought me these store-bought legs, but they were this square frame, and my brother and I welded these gussets and this extra plate just to make things more secure. I also figured now would be a good time to drill some holes on the bottom, welded some nuts so we could add these leg levelers. Sometimes the nuts will get a little bit deformed from the heat, or maybe there was some slag in there. There we go. Mo better. The legs came with 6 holes that were like a 1/4 inch, and I ended up drilling these larger holes. 1, 2, 3, 5 larger holes. That way, 4 larger holes. That way the outside could still move, expand, and contract. So rather than elongated holes, which can be a little bit tricky in metal, I just drilled oversized holes. And it's easy to see that without those extra plates and gussets that we added, if somebody were to drag this desktop across the floor, which is probably common, right? There's simply too much leverage and it would just rip them right out. Whether they were screws going into the top or inserts with machine threads, it wouldn't matter. It would tear out. I have this cut Allen key or hex key, and I let it bottom out in the chuck. And this stepped block of wood allows me to not only drive it in straight, but not drive it too far. Or too deep, I should say. Again, that middle one, I will tighten it down. There's not any slack. The 2 outside ones do have slack, and I'll just snug those up. It turned out really secure and no wobble. Fantastic. So I guess we can call that an offset breadboard. Here you can see that built up edge. I thought the butt joints in the top gave it a unique look, and they were nice and aligned so it didn't look messy. And since they're staggered, everything looks symmetrical. And remember, the spring joint will ensure that the ends of your breadboard stay tight. Anyway, that's one way to utilize thin material to make some desktops that appear to be thicker. The customer was thrilled, and that's ultimately what counts. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you tons for watching.